Hi, everybody, and welcome to the CX Industry Update. And if you looked at my LinkedIn yesterday, as it will be when you're listening to this, you'll see I've got Steve Sullivan here for an interview this edition. Steve has been working in the contact center and CX world for so long, he either really enjoys it or he's stuck in a very deep rut. Those are his words, not mine. Don't shoot, friends of Steve. He started out working for a big outsourced contact center service provider in the late 1990s, and then working client side. He spent 15 years as a freelance consultant, collaborating with some exceptional colleagues, some of who I'm hoping will be listening to this, and working for and helping brands as varied as Burberry, Gucci, The Guardian, Amex, and Harrods. So as you can see, absolutely top tier work. Thank you for joining me, Steve.
No, thanks for having me, James.
So what we're going to, yeah, absolutely. And what we're going to go through then, we've got a standard format. So we're going to cover about 5 questions off. We're going to be talking about how you'd go about building a contact center from scratch right now, what the key areas of consideration would be. And in your experience, where you've seen some great examples of that, AI as well, it wouldn't be a CCCX conversation in 2023 if we weren't pulling that move. So we're going to talk about AI as well. If there's so much positivity, we're going to talk about some of the mistakes you see as well, some of the things that our listeners can be aware of and avoiding in their environments. And also, Steve, much like myself, has his own LinkedIn newsletter, obviously slightly different focus from what I do. So we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about that and where you guys can find it as well. And I absolutely encourage you to go out there and subscribe to that as well. But jumping in then, Steve, so if you were building a contemporary contact center from scratch today, what would be your key considerations to set things up in the right way?
I think the key thing it would be, or the key initial question is, what's it for? So this came up in conversation, nothing to do with our chat, just literally the other day. And somebody said, well, it's all got to be about delivering value and, revenue optimization. But I really don't know. I think it's a lot of people go down the track of they have an operation, it's off and running, and you just got to keep that train on the tracks, which is a difficult enough job in itself. But I think it's, for some people, it's ideally, it's almost, it does deliver service, but it's about insight generation to how to get to that root cause, how to fix the things that cause the problems. Because as we all know, nobody wants to talk to a contact center. Deep down, they've got better things to do with the time. For some organizations, and I think you do see this a lot in the startup fast growth world, it's almost a reserve army of labor, which I think is what economists used to talk about in the 1930s. Who's going to do this? That contact center. Who's got loads of people? The contact center. And you see that in tiny organizations with 20 heads, probably the biggest single group of people is the contact center. And you can't give that kind of work to techies, so you give it to the contact center. That might not be what you aspire to do, but often it's what you end up being. It can be about value creation. And I think it's a truism, isn't it, that for most organizations, increasingly, a contact center is where they have most interaction with their customers or their prospects.
Yeah.
It's a great opportunity potentially to exploit that and leverage it, but we all see loads of examples of it done wrongly. If I've got a problem, don't start upselling me. Now is not the time. And the other thing that's really risen, I guess partly as a genuine issue in society, but certainly risen in terms of the perception of people like me, is around vulnerability and customers going through periods of vulnerability. And I think as we do more and more self-serve and we build more and more digital journeys, I think a lot of contact centers are increasingly a kind of repository of care and compassion for people who can't cope or don't want to get on board the self-service bus. Then the question is, to what extent are you willing to fund that? That's a different question. So I think that's a very long way of not answering your question. It kind of depends. That's what I think.
Well, no, I think that's the classic consultant's answer, isn't it? It depends. But it's absolutely right, though, isn't it? Because, and I think it's an intriguing question for people that are thinking about transforming their contact center, thinking about channels, thinking about AI, maybe thinking about transformation, investment in technology, taking it back to square one and saying, well, what is it we're actually trying to achieve here? And you made some really key points there about creation of data and insights, adding value, and also being that service that customers want if they don't want the pure digital journey, and thinking about what does that mean to your brand and your customers and your customer experience as well. So there's a lot of real key points there. I think you're absolutely right. So in all your professional experience, where have you seen some really great examples then of contact center operations? Some of the things you were talking about there.
I'll be careful about naming names, and I suppose the reality is generally I get involved in places where things aren't going as well as they could. But that's often not because people aren't skilled, people don't have a sense of ambition, don't want to do the best by their customers and the best by their stakeholders, the rest of the business. I think it's often the problem lies without the contact center. It's external, and that can be as simple as the proposition isn't right, the technical and digital tools aren't quite right. It's a minimal viable product that sort of serves 80% of people 80% of the time, but that means you get an awful lot of fall into your contact center, which I think is why when I made that slightly tongue-in-cheek point about am I stuck in a very deep rut, I probably should be really bored of all this stuff by now, but I think contact centers have got a lot more interesting over the years. They're no longer the big shed that does repetitive activities. They tend to be smaller sheds or dispersed sheds, people doing really quite complex stuff. And sometimes they're the only people in the organization who understand what they're doing, because they're dealing with these sort of quite arcane. It's around a meeting point. Obviously, you're the kind of embodiment, I think, of CX, people and technology, because that's what you're all about. And I think, and it's a bit of a cliche, but that's where these things come together. And I think I've seen interestingly, some of the best examples, I think, of empathetic service are in the third sector, in the charity sector.
Yeah.
In terms of process optimization and technology as a generality, they're decades behind their peers. But in terms of addressing a need and being willing to go to that extra mile for people, I see that because people are really bought into the mission of the organization. And that's not exclusive, I know, to somebody who's got a kind of social mission in what they do. But I think sometimes if you combine that passion with an ability to drive process, optimize process, you use technology in an aligned way, that's kind of your nirvana. But we never get to it because the pace of change increases. And actually, some of my favorite clients is when I go in and I look at something and maybe I come back in a couple of weeks and say, have you thought about, and they go, yeah, we're doing that.
Amazing.
So it's like, come on, Steve, give us something else because we can work that one out. And they're probably the best, but then perhaps sometimes you get so caught up in the hamster wheel. Sometimes it does pay actually to get an external perspective, but you don't have to pay for that. You get an external perspective from your customers, from your stakeholders, from the people who work in finance or whatever. Then that's often what really makes the difference. But fundamentally, it's a hard job. I spent my whole life observing people doing really quite difficult jobs at the front line. That's increasingly difficult, and the stats bear that out in terms of complexity, contact duration, the number of tools people are using. Some phenomenal figures. I mean, I can barely cope, as you know, with having one conversation via one digital device. There's people in contact center roles, balancing 10, 15, 20 different applications, incredibly complex. And then managing that is also very difficult, particularly at the moment when there's a massive cost pressure. And we might still talk about customer experience, but it's the money that's the biggest driver. And that might change.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was at Disrupt, this year, and I think the theme of that event was talking about, the world we're in. Everyone is a bit more anxious already, and if you're reaching out to a contact center, it's probably not for the best reason in the world, and you might be under more stress than you would perhaps like already, and that, of course, increases the difficulty of that agent's role even further, and therefore maybe the reliance on the systems, if the systems aren't 100% supporting that, are complicating it, that in itself then makes that job even harder. And it's an interesting point you touched on there about asking other areas of the business, what is it you think the contact center does? What is it? Because I was talking to someone today, I went on a meeting in London, and I was explaining to somebody the core business of what I do, and their question to me was, "Oh, like a call center." And that's your, as a well-trained professional, their mindset was somebody that answers the phones. And I said, no, no, no. And I proceeded to bore them for about 10 minutes. But that I think it is interesting when you ask other people, what is it you think the contact center does? And that touches back on our first question. And then people naturally start asking questions about this. So let's jump onto it. AI, it's the biggest talking point. What's your opinion on the opportunities that it offers businesses when it comes to customer experience?
So I suppose the most honest answer is I don't know, and none of us do. And I think we get a lot of our knowledge about these large language models from LinkedIn. And I was saying to somebody the other day, imagine a large language model AI that was just driven by what's on LinkedIn. It'd be this like hideously conceited, overweening fantasist shouting at you. So you have to be careful where the data comes from, don't you? I mean, I don't know. I think, I mean, it's a big issue. It's societal, and I don't think any of us can really get our heads around it. I think at the sort of micro level, I can see some big things in simple things that are perpetual problems, like why are people contacting us? What is the broken process? What are the multiple broken processes? What are the journeys? Where do we break? Where does the journey break? AI can just transform that kind of analysis. Even things like forecasting and scheduling staff, which is horrendous. I assume AI can just strip out a load of specialist technologies and people with quite detailed technical skills, and the AI will do it for us. So I think there's some. And the other thing is, of course, and this is slightly to one side of the contact center CX world, is you think about personas, and I've seen people virtually have stand-up fights about the concept of personas, but they are useful because it brings people back to real life and not the sort of constant pressure of demand in the contact center and that thing. So let's think about people and why have they come to us and what are they looking for, to your point. I mean, I guess we're getting to a world where we're going to have a persona of one. I'm not a middle-aged self-employed consultant lives on the South Coast. I'm just me. And in terms of what that means for the contact center and for that one-to-one customer experience, I guess I don't really know. And I think it's a great place to be, because contact centers, because of the availability of bots, some of which are genuinely driven by ML and some which maybe even AI and others clearly not, we're not exactly in the cutting edge, because if AI eats the rest of society while we've got our backs turned, that'll have passed us by. But in terms of application of AI, practical application of AI, a novel application of AI, there's an awful lot going on out there. And it is, I guess, it's a cliche. It's about aligning technology and the individual and the authentic human interaction. But I think I don't think we quite know what that means. And I'm conscious, you think of the classic case of you've got that inside view of technology where you score what James says and how he interacts with people, and is he nice to Mr. Sullivan and what did he tell him? And then you get the outside in perspective, whereas you ask me what I thought about James's interaction, and you get that classic dichotomy whereby I go, James was all wrong advice, doesn't make any sense. I think James was great. And maybe when I my thing doesn't work next time, his advice will have absolutely helped me not at all. But he was empathetic and he was supportive, and it made me feel like he'd answered my query. We can get that kind of separation of experience and reality. But what happens in an AI world where so much of the matching of the explanation and the scenario to the resolution is pre-packaged? I don't know how far that goes. And we are very focused on human authenticity, but to some extent, I'm not sure we quite know where it fits. Definitely fits somewhere, I hope, but I'm not quite sure where.
Yeah, I would love to see a large-scale survey on whether people would rather a great experience with AI or an average experience with a human when it comes to resolving a problem. Because I think I'm constantly surprised. I pose people questions like that when I talk to them. I'm always surprised. Personally speaking, being someone who works with technology regularly, give me a great experience, and I don't need to speak to a person, and I'm fine. But then I always use the automatic checkouts in a Tesco, so I'm probably the worst example of that. But I know plenty of other people would say, "Oh, I don't trust it," and they don't really understand why. But there's just something that they don't like.
And that's interesting because that's the whole behavioural aspect, isn't it? So I'm a bit like you. I do tend to go to the self-service checkouts, even though I tell myself I should talk to somebody, and then I'm the first person to get frustrated when it doesn't work. And I do end up talking to somebody because I don't obey the instructions. If I was in Asda, which I don't normally go to Asda, totally misunderstood how it worked. I think I had somebody come to me about 4 times. I was buying about 5 things. So I had a lot of personal interaction, but behaviourally, my behaviour didn't match what I would. Again, the classic thing about you research and survey, what I say isn't necessarily what I do. So yeah, no, it's fascinating stuff, I think.
I like posing people those questions. There's loads to unpack, and no, you're right. No one's got the answer, and anyone that says they do is selling snake oil, I'm sure.
I think so.
We've been through a lot of good things, a lot of positivity around great behaviours and operational things happening in the contact centre. What are the mistakes that you most commonly see companies make within their contact centres that negatively affect a customer experience, but also employee experience as well? Those all important agents we talked about.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there aren't many people left who can. I was thinking about this the other day, who can telemarket anything that anybody wants in a non-scammy way. There are people, but not many. That's a real sort of vanishing opportunity. And back in the old days, when that's what a lot of particularly outsourcers did, we actually probably did a really good job of engaging our employees because you were constantly dependent on your 3 people out of 20 who could sell stuff. And it was all about positive engagement and reinforcement and bringing up the lower tier and making people celebrate success. The ultimate outcome nowadays we'd probably frown upon somewhat, and the way those sales are made, perhaps 25 years on we might look at differently. But there were some things that were learnt then that were lost, and I think as an industry, and a lot of this is driven because it's unavoidable, and it's partly to do with difficulty to retain staff, the fact that the job is getting more difficult, both from an internal perspective in terms of what you need to do to fulfill that job and the demands from consumers, and the movement of people to go to home working, has all conspired in a really helpful way, I think, to make people realise you've got to make people want to be with you to do that job. And I've sort of noticed that over the last 3 or 4 years, that I feel that the industry's gone from lip service. Of course, I care about my staff. So we've got an annual survey, and some people fill it in, but I don't really know what they say. To genuinely engaging people, and again, it's a cliche to say, sort of for debate, but I'd always say the most difficult and the most crucial job in a contact center is that first level of management, team leader, team manager, whatever you call it. I think those people are now, partly through the benefits of technology, and there's lots of disadvantages of technology, and layering on the tech upon tech doesn't make people's lives easier. But when you get the tech right, you've got that single view of the customer, you're not toggling between multiple systems. MI is now produced pretty much automatically, and your job is to interrogate it and look for insight, not produce numbers. The best team managers and team leaders now know or have learned that what they need to be doing is reinforcing and supporting their teams to do a good job, and to do the sort of job they want to do, and to strip away a lot of the negative practices around hands up for toilet breaks, 242 seconds, no more, AHT, this sort of thing. Because again, it's part around genuine diversity as well. Again, I was talking to somebody earlier on, and they were saying they do quite a lot of social media work, and they said, and they've got a lot of home-based staff, and they said, we've got people who don't want to talk to customers because that's not their skill set. They're on social. They don't want to talk to anybody. They don't want to talk to us. They're quite happy communicating digitally. So that's a real. And these people I was talking to are, probably in the industry nearly as long as me, and they said they've had to really change their perception of how they do things, because the world has changed and consumers have changed. and the people you get working in contact centers have changed. And it's not just age and stage. You know, I think as a 45-year-old, perhaps in a return to work situation, probably got a different set of expectations of what they would want from their workplace, be it physical or virtual, than they would have done even 5 years ago. And it's a real challenge. But again, I think there aren't many places of employment where you've got, you know, scores or hundreds of people doing similar roles. There's not many of those left. And I think the contact center's gone from going back in time, the classic, you know, hideous Victorian mill type work culture where everything everything was measured, but there's no value to anything, to actually now embracing some much more positive aspects of how do you, you know, lead, coach, and manage people. And I think that's kind of almost inspiring. I'm sounding a bit giddy now, aren't
I always find our conversations really, really interesting, and I think, you know, one of the things you unpack so much there in a short space of time, and hopefully people leading that team leader role upwards through contact center in organizations where contact center is part of that structure, you know, they're listening and thinking there's some points there that I'm not seeing, and some things maybe that we are doing, but maybe we could be doing better as well. And obviously, you know, I'll be including your LinkedIn page in the article so people can reach out to you directly. But the other place they can find all your great knowledge and thought for free on a regular basis is the newsletter that I talked about at the start of our conversation. So just tell us a bit more about that and where people can find it.
Yeah, so I'll give you a very brief bit of potted history. So I've been doing this for too long, as we know, and compliance and the regulations has always been part of what I do. And I've pretty much always made it my business to it not be my business and it be somebody else's problem, because who wants to do that stuff? And I'm on one of the councils at the Data and Marketing Association, and one of my many collaborators, my good friend Neris Caulfield, when she was the chair of that council, said, right, the person who's doing this has left. We need somebody to do compliance. I said, I'm not going to do compliance because we've got to do compliance. So I did compliance. And this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, as GDPR was sort of hovering over the horizon.
Yeah.
And I bizarrely got quite interested in it. It's like a weird old man's hobby. And I often say to people, although I do some paid compliance work, I'm not a compliance person, but I do understand the whole world, I think, of customer acquisition, retention, and service. And it's about how does certain compliance issues and requirements apply to our world, if you like. And I just felt, and I still feel, there's a lot of people who think the way to deliver advice into this world is to make it sound really complicated and really scary. And occasionally it is, but it's generally not quite as complicated and scary as people think. And it's all about the risk analysis that you do. You know, you can spend all day worrying about regulation and compliance, and you need to spend some of your time worrying about regulation and compliance. But there's a kind of risk factor, like there is in everything you do in the world of work. So my newsletter, and I'm learning from yours. I need some more on LinkedIn, but currently it's a monthly traditional email newsletter, as you say, free, marvelous value. It's a quick read. I try and stick to the facts, relatively punchy, the odd joke in there just to lift things up. It's a quick read, shouldn't take you too long, and the aim is every month you should find 1 or 2 things that are of relevance or might just help you out, either because you've never heard of it before, or possibly because somebody within your organization, particularly if it's a big organization, or a client or a supplier, is saying you've got to do this. Now, most of us don't know whether we should do that or not. So sometimes I try and just, you know, encapsulate some of those areas or concerns and say, well, do you really need to do it? Why do you need to do it? Who says? Is it really the law? And that's really the purpose. So yeah, that's my contribution to the wider world.
There we go. Go to Steve's LinkedIn, find his newsletter, sign up for it, subscribe. 1 read a month, it could save you thousands of pounds. You never know, from not having to do something you're being told to do, and improve your contact center into the bargain as well. Well, Steve, again, thank you very much for your time. As I say, I really always do enjoy our conversations.
Me too.
Just, you know, the experience is there, and it's wonderful how you can put points across really simply, but you can connect it to the real world in so many great examples. So yeah, really appreciate your time, and we'll speak again soon. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, James. Thanks very much.